Hello, everybody. I think Bill is pushing the buttons that will allow us to convene, and yes, we are off. My name is Mark Hughes. I'm the faculty director of the Kleinman Center here at the Weitzman School of Design, the lucky stewards of space in this fantastic Fisher Fine Arts Library that we're so grateful for occupying. And it's nice to see all of you here today on the second day of Energy Week. This is a fantastic panel that very prepared and I'm sure very inspiring representatives of a specific sector. It's part of a larger week of energy related events that have brought together students and faculty and staff from many of the schools at the university. Lindsay, what did you say? Corey, seven schools, 7 of our 12 schools at Penn are represented in the events of the week. So it's growing every year and has become kind of one of the high points of the year for the Kleinman Center in particular and the university at large. We have a number of partners that allow panels like this one. And in fact, in this particular panel, we've got partners with Penn Sustainability, with Penn IUR, the Institute for Urban Research, our good friends there, of longstanding. Penn Environmental Innovations Institute, new friends that are building connections across the campus and its 12 schools, and then us. So, and we're providing the room and Bill's fantastic support and a few other features as well. Now, let me kind of just in very broad strokes, you know, it's possible to talk about the energy system and in fact, talk about the importance of a specific sector in so many ways that it gets confusing, right? There's lots of interesting both specification of the categories and how we measure the data that represent those categories. But one that's very prominent always is cities, the role of cities, largely because in the last few decades, the world has become a majority urban place. Most humans now live in a way that is very different from all the millennia before. Most humans now live in cities around the world. So they've becoming important in lots of ways. They've also become important to the energy system because they represent such a substantial fraction. They're disproportionate to even their increasing population in terms of their energy consumption. And increasingly, because of the changing technology by which we produce energy, they are also becoming more important into distributed production of energy as well. So they are major players in the system. And within those cities, anchor institutions like universities also represent a profoundly important part of both the consumption and also increasingly the generation of energy. They're also, of course, obviously, places of great innovation. And we have people who represent that innovation from 3, and I'm not going to introduce, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague moderator, but I'm going to introduce her. But we have 3 representatives from universities that exemplify this kind of best practice and continuous innovation orientation to the challenges that we're all facing. Now, I don't know her very well because she's both new to the city and long past my own time in city government, but Catherine Leonetti serves as the Chief of Staff for the City of Philadelphia's Office of Sustainability, which I helped found. That where she oversees, not we anymore, where she oversees the department's strategy and portfolio of initiatives across climate mitigation, resilience, environmental justice, and municipal energy. Prior to moving to Philadelphia, she lived in Mexico, where she worked in corporate strategy, but later left the private sector to pursue climate activism and advocacy. Thank you. She holds an MBA from Cornell with concentrations in sustainable global enterprise and environmental finance, and her BA from Oberlin College in visual art and sociology. I love that trajectory. That's great. So, Catherine, I'm going to turn it over to you now to introduce our distinguished panelists.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. Opening up my notes here. Okay, so just a few opening remarks from the city perspective. The idea behind this conversation is to explore the role of cities in decarbonization and the urban institutions like higher education that are very important in making those plans happen, both as thought leaders in the space and also as owners of, big portfolios that have a bunch of assets that need to be decarbonized. And coming from the city perspective, I've seen that a lot of institutions and cities have, big goals and plans around those goals and are taking concrete action steps to reach them. But at the same time, cities are really complex environments. And each one of the cities you'll hear from today, New York, Philadelphia, and Boston have, very different economic, social, and political environments. And the plans, that they're making and enacting have to be dynamic to meet the different demands of those cities. So each one of the panelists is going to talk a little bit about their plans for their specific institutions. I'm going to provide a little bit of insight that I've seen from the city in the relatively short time that I've been there. And from there, we'll do a Q&A session. We have a few questions that we've prepared, and then on top of that, we'll be taking questions from people in the audience, and I'll be fielding questions from Zoom for those of you who are online. So to introduce the panelists, we have Julie Newman, Director of Sustainability at MIT. We have Jessica Prata, Assistant Vice President for the Office of Sustainability with Columbia, and Nina Morris, the Sustainability Director of the University of Pennsylvania. So I'm going to turn it over. Oh, sorry. One more thing that we have here. Oh, is this your, no?
The slides are out of order.
Yeah.
Okay.
Those are the last slides.
Oh,
You want to go back to the beginning.
Yeah. Get a preview.
Yeah, exactly.
Keep going.
Keep going.
Keep
Okay.
Yeah, Columbia,
that.
keep going.
Don't close your eyes, everybody.
Right.
My surprise. There we go.
And just before we get started, Julie, we wanted to put some common terms up here on the screen because we're going to be discussing a lot of terms that have to do with decarbonization generally. And sometimes, those terms have changed and developed over time. So just to keep everybody on the same page, these terms will help clarify some of the presentations that follow. And I'll turn it over to Julie.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. All right. Well, wonderful to be here with all of you. I'm always humbled by participating on such panels. And we were just saying that anytime one engages, clearly all of you in higher education, you just take this moment to take a deep dive and really thinking through messaging and really exploring what each other's doing. So I just, in terms of a model of how to exchange best practice, do panels, because you just take that moment and you slow down and you have that opportunity for exchange. So thank you again for including me in this panel. I'm hoping this becomes a combination of being very organized with remarks combined with just having a conversation with the audience, because I want to make it clear that we're sharing with you what we're working on and how we're thinking about this. But I'll get to this in a moment, but with the IPCC report that came out yesterday, I'll allude to that without getting too down about it. This is an all-in moment for all of us. So I'm hoping it can be this combination today of us sharing with you in a succinct way of what we're doing, and then just opening up, because I imagine we have a lot of experts that are just in the audience with ideas. So as I mentioned, in preparing for today, my colleagues and I opened up an informed discussion as to how all three of us are navigating in this space, and we quickly found common challenges, opportunities, and strategies. And I think there's actually more in common than we have as differences. And I'm hoping we can, we'll work through the differences in our own locations, but I'm hoping what this panel does in partnership with Kleinman is find those opportunities for strategic common ground. So let's hope. Oh, no, once again, these are in the wrong order. Let's try this.
There you
Okay,
go.
here we go. All right. So a couple of key points that will help frame my remarks throughout the panel today. As we're planning at MIT, we're planning for today, as we're thinking about climate, as I share with you, but we're really also planning for the next 100 years. So when we work on climate resiliency modeling, we have models that take us out to 2100, looking at climate, looking at projected storms, for example. Same with mitigation. As we're looking at climate mitigation, we have a net zero goal we'll get to shortly of 2050, but it clearly doesn't end there. So it's really using that trajectory, I think, of 100 plus year time frame. MIT is a you can all see that, right? MIT is a campus of approximately 24,000 faculty, staff, researchers, and students. We have over 450 labs, departments, and centers that strewn across 170 buildings and occupying about 13 million square feet across 168 acres. We're a very dense urban environment. Operating revenue of about 3.9 billion. And we all decided, I think you all did it, but just to take note as we think about the evolution of old infrastructure, we moved to the Cambridge area in 1916. And so I believe there's some physicists in the room, we're dealing with a physics problem too, in terms of the, the below grade infrastructure as we think about new structures that will be needed for decarbonizing our campus. So we really take all of this together as we compare and contrast what's available to us. The city of Cambridge is a city of approximately 123,000 residents. And part of what I learned is actually growing at a rate of about 1% a year. And though MIT is not located in Boston, I want to note that many members of our MIT community clearly are citizens of Boston, and Boston's a city of approximately 700,000 residents. So when I speak today, I'm speaking specifically on projects between MIT and Cambridge, because that's what I was asked to come and present. But when we think about the greater urban area, we're thinking about our relationship to Boston. We can't get to campus without Boston infrastructure, right? So we'll integrate that. I'm sure there's relatability across our campuses on that note too. Cambridge has been committed to sustainability and climate leadership action, for over a decade, I'm guessing multiple decades, but in terms of formalized structures of integration, they launched something called the Cambridge Compact over 10 years ago. That was an agreement between MIT, Harvard, Cambridge, and 16 other industry partners located in the Kendall Square area to really formalize a partnership that would lead to climate and sustainability action. So that's an important foundation. No, we're not addressing the issues that we came here to talk about today, just out of thin air. There's been a strong, deep partnership for decades. An essential principle that underlines this work that you'll hear about that I think is important for us to weave in together is the essential principle of trust, that you have to build trust over time between campus city. And again, that trust is broken here and there, but the trust between my office, let's say, and my colleagues at MIT with the city government has been built over decades. There's even a person, I'm sure we all have it, who's responsible for just going back and forth. So I just think that's an essential underlying component that we have to touch upon today. That's the foundation of our ongoing work. The city is now committed to, as you see here, to a carbon neutrality goal by 2050. That didn't come at us. We all sat on those committees to help the city get to that point. So they're committed to carbon neutrality by 2050, and as of 2021, they reduced emissions by approximately 38% below 2008 levels, is what they're reporting. On the MIT front, there's a lot to say here, but I know I'm supposed to be brief. In May 2021, President Reif and our senior leaders at the time, we have a new president since then, by the way, we announced a renewed commitment. This is our second plan for climate action. It's a whole lecture in and of itself, because it's just, I have to say it's awesome, because it involves commitments around research, policy, innovation, partnership, and the role of the campus. And that's clearly what I'm accountable for. So that's all I can speak to time-wise today. But the call, and I just want to put this at the high level, is for humanity. This is a quote: humanity must find affordable, equitable ways to bring every sector of the global economy to net zero emissions no later than 2050. And so again, similar to, so that all-in moment that I'm calling, that's coming out of MIT. We're calling on the entire campus to respond to this challenge. So this is all built on the premise that climate change is one of the biggest challenges of our time. I think the timeliness of the IPCC, I don't know if you planned for that, Kleinman and you, but that only made it more urgent as of last night. MIT is now committed to achieving net zero. So this is key. We're net zero by 2026, but we're committed to reducing to zero direct emissions by 2050 for scopes 1 and 2. So distinguishing between what we call net zero and zero direct emissions. So I know there were some language you showed at the beginning, but that's also probably a point of I think shared and potential difference there. We're preparing for a changing climate and committed to establishing also a climate resiliency plan, which is also such a component of these urban institutional relationships because climate change sees no bounds. I just want to say embedded in this new plan, which we'll get to, is a call for the imperative of justice, which we'll touch upon shortly. But the plan states that disadvantaged and minority communities that have borne the brunt of the economic and health consequences of systemic environmental injustice must be heard and have their concerns addressed. So again, I'm not going to have the answer for that today, but it's embedded in our plan, and it's something that is in we're all in deep discussion about. We track our progress and hold ourselves accountable to these goals through transparent process of measuring and reporting. And two more quick takeaways. We're committed to achieving immediate and significant impact, reducing emissions by catalyzing offsite renewable projects in the near term, which we see as key to accomplishing the 2026 commitment. But on-site, we're accelerating all of our actions towards deeper energy reductions from existing buildings, electrifying buildings, deep energy retrofits, solar, again, also shared strategies that I think you'll hear about. And so we're planning for the next energy era. That's what I have to rush back to campus for. We're in deep discussions right now on getting the support to figure out how to reconstitute our district energy system. And so again, shared issues here. And most importantly, we must recognize that we cannot solve for sustainability and climate action within the walls of our institute alone. So I think that's a key takeaway. And I believe that's why I'm even here with you guys today, because I've been talking about this for more than a decade, as we have to see the nested strategies in terms of the role of the individual, the campus, the city, the state, the nation, the globe. So we're not thinking about decarbonizing strictly through, something that's going to happen at the global level, and we don't have to do anything, but we also need to figure out, we really need nested strategies and scales of investment. And so as you see here, I've been in this field for over 2 decades, and to me, this has been phenomenal to see this alignment of policy across these scales right now. And I'll be curious what happens with yesterday's IPCC report, if that actually accelerates anything, maybe at the campus city level. I'm not sure at the beyond that, but I think it's something we should all keep an eye on together. So I think time-wise, I'll leave it at that. But if there is time for us to address what came out of yesterday's report, it might be an interesting part of our discussion is how do these reports accelerate the work we do? How do we envision that influencing? Where are there opportunities for leapfrogging when we hear the science-backed reports come out in terms of how we're doing? So I'll save those comments for later on. All right. Thank you so much. And next will be Jessica.
Excellent. Thanks, Julie.
Yeah.
How's my mic? We're good? How's everybody doing? So it's nice to meet all of you. My name's Jess Prata. As earlier mentioned, I run the sustainability office at Columbia, and it is such an honor to be here. And I want to thank Nina and Bill and everyone involved in this amazing event. And I just can't stop from being stunned from the building we're sitting in. I'm obsessed with it. So it's great to be here. I'll do something similar to Julie and just give some high level overview about Columbia, some of the goals that have been set both at the city level and also at the state level. 2019 was a pretty big year for New York with some landmark legislation. And so I'm just going to dive in and do that for you all. And I'm going to first start by going the right direction on the slides. Okay. So just a right aerial shot here of Manhattan. Columbia is 16 million square feet. You see 3 of the campuses here on the island of Manhattan. There's one more campus that we have that's a little farther north in New York State. And so the areas of opportunity are great, and included in the way that we approach our sustainability planning efforts is really to try and be as inclusive as possible. And in our last sustainability plan, what we sought to do is, while our campuses are so different, they have different operating models, different leadership structures, different ways of being financed, we tried to align at least at the highest levels of climate goal setting. So What is not in a slide, but what I'll talk about briefly is just what the city goals are and what the state goals are. So at a city level, one of the recent landmark legislations that was released in 2019 is Local Law 97. And what Local Law 97 seeks to do is part of the Mayor's Green New Deal. And what it seeks to do is to put greenhouse gas emission caps on buildings of 25,000 square feet and over, many of them. And this law will go into effect and actually begin to go and, really take off in 2024, but it's going to escalate over the course of the next 10 plus years. So by 2030, some of the fines and the way that it's organized is much more dramatic. At a state level, the Climate Action and Community Protection Act was also launched in 2019. And in addition to also at a state level setting greenhouse gas reduction goals, it also does begin to integrate the bill in fact states that 35% of the benefits of clean energy and energy efficiency must go to disadvantaged communities. It also mandates that 70% of electricity must come from renewable sources. So with that as a backdrop and recognizing how monumental both of those pieces of legislation were, as we were building our sustainability plan, we made sure to obviously keep those in focus and to build those into the way we're thinking about things. What you see here on the slide is really at a high level, the 6 main sections of Columbia's sustainability plan. We call it Plan 2030. We launched this plan in 2021, and campus energy, in addition to the way we build, how do we transport people? How do we manage our materials on campus? How do we handle water? How do we also connect the campus as a lab for students and faculty that are thought leaders on this topic? How do we build stronger partnerships with them to be able to explore and use the campus as a lab, to continue to learn and do what we're all there to do. So at a high level here, Plan 2030, the point of this slide is just to demonstrate that with the 2 laws that I spoke about in focus, what we also sought to do with our plan was to really ground ourselves in climate science. And we consulted with the UNEP and also with the Science Based Target Initiative to better understand available trajectories to Columbia. And we applied our own data, and then we used that to set our own specific goals. The end goal being net zero by 2050. So the 2 types of science-based targets that we are holding ourselves to is the first is an absolute emission reduction target, which you can see on the bottom. So over time, we've got to make sure that we are reducing those emissions, in a scaled way over time. On the top, you'll see that we also have committed ourselves to a cumulative emissions limit, which makes sure that we're not kicking the can down the road. We can't wait until 2040 to make sure we're starting to take action. And I would say that we're absolutely not doing that. There's so much work underway now on campus, starting with something similar to what Julie mentioned, taking a look at our central energy plant and figuring out what kind of opportunities we have to electrify that. And from there, everything starts to roll. So we're actively working on this, and all of the analysis and the thought behind this that's being done by so many of my colleagues back at Columbia are considering not only these science-based targets, but also taking deep consideration for the city law and also the state law. My clicker. And this slide basically drives that point home. At the bottom, you'll see that Local Law 97, if you lay that over our projected usage and some of our projected scope 1 and 2 emissions, we see that up until about 2030, right, we're sort of gliding along the top. And then as those caps begin to come into play, we see that there's going to be a required reduction that's very steep. So our job now is to be actively planning so that we stay out ahead of that, and we can do our part as responsible citizens in the city and in the state to reduce our impact and obviously stay on top of things as the law continues to evolve. Some of the pathways and opportunities that we are looking at, and these are hypothetical mitigation strategies, but many of the focus areas here won't be surprising, and they're probably very similar for many of our institutions, but obviously in different scales. So taking a look at how are we going to be relying on renewable electricity. Local Law 97 does set into stone some restrictions around that. So making sure we track that and stay on top of how that opportunity evolves. How does that play into our numbers and our analysis? Taking a look at obviously energy conservation, any transition of fuel, also taking a look at deep energy conservation and electrification, which is actively in play now. So we mapped this out when we put out the plan, and it's just a starting point. And like so much of the work we do, it has to be done in real time as things are constantly shifting and we're getting new information in. And so it really needs to remain flexible, and yet we need to remain firm in our commitment. So it's always a dance. And that's actually what's most fun about the work, I think. So it's my pleasure to now pass the mic over to Nina.
Thank you so much. And I think that was such a great ending, because that's exactly the sort of message we hope you sort of learn from us today, is that we're building the plane as we're going. And so, we're really trying to figure out how do we address climate change in real time while also holding firm the direction and the strategies. And so I think I'm just sitting here just amazed and learning so much in real time too, which is great to see. And I'm really grateful to both Jess and Julie for being here today. And I think it speaks volumes that why I love working in higher education is that we get to collaborate and share this knowledge. It's not like we're keeping this to ourselves. We absolutely go out to each other and come back with better ideas. We share what works and what doesn't work, because we have a big problem in front of us. And so we have to be able to scale it as quickly as possible. So thank you for being a part of that with us. And hopefully I pressed the right button. Let's see. I did. Excellent. So I'm also super grateful that Catherine's here today from the City Sustainability Office in Philadelphia. So Catherine can jump in too to help me with any of the comments I make about Philadelphia. So for those who aren't aware, the University of Pennsylvania is part of the Philadelphia, and Philadelphia was actually founded, I had to look it up because I didn't remember, in 1740. And I also learned that Benjamin Franklin used to sell heat as part of one of his many, many jobs. So I thought, oh, how apropos for today's conversation. So I just think that's, we're working with energy systems that have been around since 1740. And I think that's actually a message that Julie and Jess can relate to as well, is that, these are challenges that we're facing today, but it's a historic issue as well. And so, thinking in the context of the larger narrative of energy use, we really are the stewards of that today. So I think that's kind of an interesting point to kind of drive home. So the city of Philadelphia has the Green Works plan, which has been updated over the years, and has a city goal to reach net zero by 2050. And they do an amazing job supporting annual reports to demonstrate their progress to that. And so they've achieved a 44% reduction. And some big strides have been made in the past few years, particularly with the commercial building. I'm going to get it wrong. Is it the Philadelphia Building Energy Performance Policy and Program? So that policy was set in motion. I guess it was written a couple of years ago, but it just started to kind of hit the ground. And what that policy really enforces is commercial buildings over 50,000 square feet have to either be a high performing building or do what they're calling building energy tune-ups. And so what that does is helps ensure that the large scale buildings, those if you will, the meat and potatoes of Philadelphia's carbon footprint are being run as efficiently as possible. So it's a really important legislation that requires support from our larger community members on the commercial side to make that happen, and Penn is a part of that. So I think that's a great step in the right direction. It demonstrates the city's commitment to figuring out solutions that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, while also being understanding that it is a complex place and there are a lot of competing priorities that the city has to address. And so I think that's one of the brilliant things about Greenworks too, is that it also has a strong focus on the priorities of the Philadelphia community. We have one of the highest poverty rates for a large city. And I think that is folded in really well with the Greenworks plan, with strong focus on how can we best support those that are feeling the largest impacts of climate change. And so really grateful that the city does help and provide that guidance. So the University of Pennsylvania, similar to Julie and Jess, we are a dense urban institution. We've got 28,000 students. We are about 300 acres in West Philadelphia. We have over 180 buildings, aging in range from 1873 to 2023. So really just a variety of buildings that we have to maintain, and having that kind of how to best optimize all those buildings is definitely a challenging task. We have over 690 labs in over 1.2 million square feet. That's important because labs are huge energy consumers, and so really require some thoughtful approaches to ensure that those spaces are optimized while also doing the great work that is needed in those spaces. And Penn also is actually 28% of our campus is green space, which in the context of Philadelphia is an important thing because as y'all are aware, we have more heat days, extreme heat days than ever before. And urban heat island impacts are extreme in Philadelphia. And so keeping green space not only is good for people in terms of health and well-being, but it also does a lot to help mitigate some of the impacts of climate change. We also have our version of, I guess, our strategic plan is the Climate and Sustainability Action Plan 3.0. So this is our third iteration of our strategic plan. So we update it every 5 years, and we are coming to the close of 3.0. So I'm looking to my peers and sort of like taking notes as like what your goals are and like how we can best sort of reimagine where we need to go, especially in the context of this new information through the IPCC report. So a lot of interesting conversations to be had on our campus. And I won't go into the details of this, but if you're curious about our larger strategy, it is similar to Columbia, and that we've got multiple areas in which we focus, and actually MIT too. So we break it down by 7 key initiative areas, and then we track our progress towards all the things that we said we're going to do to make sure it happens. So those are some of the highlights that we have. So decarbonization is a prong of many pieces within the larger Climate and Sustainability Action Plan, but it is the goal that we have most, that we report on, and we every year have a report that shares our progress specifically on our carbon. So a very key part of our strategy. And to talk about that a little more, so this is Penn's carbon footprint. We have a baseline year of 2009, and you can see our progress mapped out to 2022, and then a projected for fiscal year 2024. So similarly, we have reached a 45% reduction in fiscal year 22, which tracks pretty close to what the city has achieved. And you can see that the biggest change, I think you can probably tell from this graph, is that dark blue is our electric consumption. And you can see that really starts to trickle down, and that's because mostly through the greening of the grid. But also we've been getting better about how we utilize electricity within our buildings. And then you'll see a precipitous drop in fiscal year 24, which is upcoming. And that's when our solar PPA comes online. And so right now under construction in Fulton County, Pennsylvania, we have 2 large solar facilities that are underway. And it's going to be big. It's like 220 megawatts. And once it's online, it'll be the equivalent energy consumption for both of 70% of the main campus as well as the health system. So it's a really big project that will make a big step in our decarbonization strategies. We also employ offsets, particularly for our scope 3 emissions when it comes to air travel. So we just launched that policy last year. And what that does is basically charges anybody who travels on behalf of Penn a small fee, and then that fee then offsets our the emissions from air travel. So that has been, this is the first year we purchased carbon offsets for our air travel, and now we sort of check that off of our greenhouse gas emissions every year, which is a scope 3. So we can't really do much about it. So this is our offsets are our best path forward there. Yeah, I think that generally covers the big hits. Okay, that's the end of that. So I'll turn it back to Catherine.
Okay, great. So now we're going to move into a moderated Q&A portion. We have about 15 minutes left. So I was thinking we'd do about 25 minutes in this portion and then 25 minutes for questions from the audience. So the first question that we have planned today is about how cities and institutions can work together to achieve urban decarbonization. And I think one of the things we'd really like to dig in on with this question is how the city's carbon goals and policies have an impact on higher eds. And how I think all of you have touched on that a little bit, but just speaking a little bit more about the relationship, whether it's collaboration or goal setting between cities and your respective institutions.
Are you going to start on that?
I don't remember who's starting.
I can start. I'm going to start.
But
Julie, you want to start?
it's a conversation, so I think we can.
I can start. So I guess I would answer that question simply in that there's like endless opportunities for higher ed institutions and cities to be collaborating on this massive goal. And just to sort of spotlight a couple of things, I mean, cities obviously have the influence, the power to legislate, the power to also elevate and drive action around climate in a way that makes everyone sort of say, all right, well, let's just figure out how to tackle that. Higher ed institutions bring obviously a community of people who are dedicated to research, to creating thought leadership on topics, and also educating the next generation of leaders on this. We also help to spotlight problems and to spotlight solutions. So it's ripe for collaboration. In New York City, what I thought was neat, when one of the first sustainability plans came out under Mike Bloomberg in New York City, it was back in, I think, 2006, they launched Plan NYC. And as part of that, they created something called the Carbon Challenge, and they targeted different industries in the city. So it was, started with hospitals and universities and moved on from there to other kinds of organizations. But they invited members of those groups to voluntarily sign on to carbon reduction goals. So it was the first, at least that I remember, opportunity for different institutions in the city that were going to start to work towards decarbonization and climate action to come together with the city at the helm and say, look, we're going to meet monthly. We're going to talk about opportunities. We're going to talk about where you are. We're going to talk about things you're doing so everyone can learn. And it was awesome. And it was a great community building way. And it was the city that really created that opportunity for us. In addition, there was a requirement in being a part of the Carbon Challenge, in addition to committing your institution to a set greenhouse gas reduction goal, was to report your progress. So if you hadn't been doing a greenhouse gas inventory, this was a really good reason to start. And again, this was a long time ago. And it helped many institutions in the city, I think, get organized around how they were accounting for their emissions. And I think that really helped to grease the wheels fast forward to many of the pieces of legislation I spoke about, specifically Local Law 97. There was already engagement. Many institutions were already moving towards this. And obviously, it's a very big step at a very different level, what the law puts in play. But I think that the collaboration pieces were there. And faculty had been contributing to, I think, the thought leadership around the law. So it's there's a lot of opportunity.
Yeah, I think that's your point about collaboration is really important, and the voluntary nature of those programs. I think that really mirrors what we've seen in Philadelphia as well, is that when it usually starts as like a voluntary, like, hey, like, wouldn't it be cool if you got involved with this? And the city's role in sort of pushing that forward is really essential. I think in Philadelphia, there's strategic planning is definitely a key piece of that. And you kind of mentioned that too, is that faculty can help sort of shape that. There's been in Philadelphia in particular, like a strong connection between higher education partners and the Office of Sustainability in the city for a long time. And I think that's just continuing today. We do a lot of communication with the city to hear about what are their priorities and how can we best support that in our strategic planning as well. So like, for example, our plan is coming to an end in 2024, and we've already met with the city to sort of hear from them, what are your priorities for us and how can we best bake that into what we're planning, so we can be that support for you. As one of the larger, emitters and consumers within the Philadelphia community, we have a responsibility to hold ourselves accountable to that and to be what the city needs us to be. And so it's really about being at the table with the city and hearing what their needs are and baking that into what we are setting up for ourselves.
Great. I'll just add a couple of more. I don't want to repeat some of the strategies you have, but I mean, just to level set, I think we're all suggesting that these are complex relationships that warrant ongoing work, right? Because city government, people's change, right? These are moving structures. So it's a combination of dedicated partnership, politics clearly, and leadership from both the higher ed and the city side, and obviously citizens, right? We've got citizens. We've got. Sorry, I don't remember the numbers. But we have on our side. We have people who work at MIT and live in the city of Cambridge. So it's a very rich circular economy of knowledge and activism and commitment towards climate leadership. I'm going to weave in a couple of pieces here. I'll just start with a quick anecdote, which you guys are reminding me of. When I first got to MIT back in 2013, 2014, MIT didn't have any climate commitment. There was not a sustainability plan. I was brought there to found the office and to really start to build what I say carbon as a currency in the structure. And sorry, in my presentation, I didn't get into everything we were doing. I was really targeting the focus on decarbonizing the campus for today, but there's a lot more there. And so I was within a couple months assigned to be the liaison to this new net zero committee. We were just getting up and running. I was just starting to understand Cambridge politics, if you will. But just to say the least, I sat at the table representing MIT, but not representing the climate commitment. And so it didn't give me quite the voice I have today, right? And so in response to the question, how do city carbon policies impact higher ed? They do. It's really helpful when cities have those goals. And then the key is to align yourself in good time. So we did that over time. But I remember, having a voice at the table, but it wasn't as strong without a commitment. And we were just still building our own commitment as well. Cities have financial leverage, they have regulatory, they have ordinances. I think we'll get into some of that. Clearly, local law 97. Local law 97 is something we've had our eye on for 5 years. We've been waiting for it, and if everybody doesn't understand what that is, that's something that's worth getting into. Ours is called the Building Energy Use Disclosure Ordinance. It's not quite passed yet, but we've gone from a discussion just 10 years ago on building a net zero plan within the city of Cambridge. Harvard had just committed to theirs, who's another player at the table in Cambridge. So it's a complex array of politics and institutions, and then here we are by 2021, just less than 10 years later, with a commitment to zero direct emissions by 2050. So it's this convergence of these higher ed institutions with the city now coming together to figure out how are we going to solve this. So just again, that's the fast forward Cliff Note version, but just interesting politics weaving together of how to both do goal setting, together independently, and then what has to take place on the campus and what has to take place collectively, and what are these unique leverage points that the city has, versus the institute. So again, we're certainly not alone in that, but there's rich opportunity for faculty to study that, rich opportunity to really understand what those relationships could be, and again, same with the city of Boston. I think we've said this, but I just want to clarify, because I think this is really at the heart of why we're here today, is this unique role of higher education. So I just want to put like a call out box on this so we can put it in the context here, is that this is how I frame it at MIT, so I can't speak for those two, but I think of, the role of higher education in this before I get back to what the city has to do. I bring these three key points to all of the work I do. Is ultimately, we want to be a model of sustainability and climate leadership, a model for our students, for our community partners, and for other institutions, and think about what the transformed organization is. And where I'm going to, carefully step into that arena is that the institutions we have today, I would argue, are not necessarily prepared for this changing climate in terms of the staffing that we have, how we're structured, how we make decisions, how we relate to the city. So what is that transformed organization that we're going to need to respond to what was called for again yesterday by the IPCC report? The other piece that we're all here for today is the second part is we're a generator of research on climate and sustainability. And so how do we actively engage that, proactively engage that, with our cities, and what can we both learn from the city, and where do we partner with the city on those opportunities to learn and really leverage ourselves as test beds, both independently and collectively. And the third part is educational innovators. There's so much opportunity for preparing the workforce of the future through higher education. And so what is going to be needed to actually achieve the kind of work and the quantity of work at the pace that we have to go to actually intervene and solve for these problems. So those are the three key pieces that I bring into these discussions. So with that said, I'll just end by saying, in terms of back to the question of how can cities and institutions work together, we need cohesiveness in our plans right now, and we're moving towards that. But rather than having all of these independent plans strewn throughout, Cambridge and Boston, we're seeing that happening, particularly on the Cambridge and Boston side, but we're getting there. And so, how do we work together to mitigate emissions? Where are the opportunities to work together versus independently? Where are the opportunities for partnerships? What's the role of regulatory compliance? So one is cohesiveness in our plans. Two is to drive early investments in the energy transition infrastructure as well. And so this might include, but not necessarily limited to, remember, keep my nested circles in place, right? We can't decarbonize without the evolution of the grid at the city level and at the state level. So we need to do a grid planning process at the MIT front, where those discussions are starting to happen and must happen with Eversource. We need to expedite approval processes for siting equipment, permitting, and understanding what those risks are with the potential of intervening and interjecting new technologies. And we need to think about zoning and permitting incentives. And so that comes into play quite a lot in our area. And third piece, I would say, is this meaningful outreach. I mean, again, think about the nested structures. I was on this call, I helped co-instruct this class at MIT called Solving for Carbon Neutrality at MIT, and it invites students into informing our process together as to how are we going to decarbonize the campus. And each year we bring a speaker in, often a different speaker, to just get an update on the evolution of our grid. In our case, it's ISO New England. And the speaker on Monday was walking through, similar to the graphs you see. And there was a pretty large chunk here that was really reliant on individual choices around home improvements, around energy interventions in the home, around EV infrastructure, electric vehicles. And so that really worried me, in terms of how much is relying on the individual choice and how much is going to be relying on the industry, and systems perspective. And we have to, I think our role as higher education is we have to understand and toggle between all of them. So in conclusion, on the third part we need with the city is that meaningful outreach. I learned more and more about this money available in our case through, well, all of us have access to the the Inflation Reduction Act with the IRA. And we have Mass Save, we have this funding available to homeowners, but how can we work with the city to help outreach at the citizen level? So there are structures that exist. There are plenty of committees, and as I said, there's a compact, there's a Green Ribbon Commission. Those are great models, and I think we just have to continue to leverage and activate those. So I'll pause with that. But thanks.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, so I think a second question that I think is really relevant from the city's perspective is that in recent years, we've been taking much more of a focus on environmental justice and resilience based on feedback from constituents that, in addition to planning for decarbonization, we also need to take into account the reality for people living in the city. And a lot of that means things like increased risk of flooding and, as some of the panelists mentioned before, heat. So I'm hoping that we can address the next question, the role of higher ed in the path towards a just energy transition. So not only, making and meeting these goals, but how are we incorporating the idea of environmental justice as we're executing those strategies?
Do you want me to
Start us
jump
off?
into that one? Yeah.
I mean,
Anybody's fine.
I feel like we're all ready to jump in on this one. I guess I'll start.
Please.
So, I mean, I'm fortunate that I get to talk with Catherine and the city on a pretty regular basis about this. And, but I do think, just broadly speaking, I think about the resources that we have and how we can best utilize the resources within higher education to inform the decision-making process. So what comes to mind for me is like the fact that we need to understand, where are the largest impacts of climate change going to happen? Where is flooding happening? Where are the urban heat island impacts? And so mapping is a really key part of that. And higher education plays a great role in that. And I know that's something that the city in particular and Philadelphia utilizes to help inform where to prioritize mitigation strategies. And so I think that's one example of a way that higher education can support the city's efforts in terms of a just transition. And I think just, again, it's all about understanding the needs of the larger community and responding to that. And so that's why communication is so important, and really just playing the role of listener, I think, is one of the biggest things that higher education partners can do, is just listen to our neighbors, listen to city government, hear where the needs are, and then take that knowledge and figure out how we can best utilize what we know, what we're experts in, and how to bring that to bear. And then also leveraging the fact that we are large customers. In the case of Philadelphia and the University of Pennsylvania, we don't really produce a lot of energy on our campus. Most of our electricity comes from our larger grid, PJM, and then our steam is produced by a company called Vicinity, just in Grace Ferry. And so we can work the fact that we are large customers into the larger conversations and influence the kind of technology that's brought to bear to encourage the just transition needed for the larger community writ large. So I think that's one of the key pieces that universities can play.
I have a couple of quick comments on that. I just want to draw us back to the CLCPA, which I think built into the law states that we need to be committed to thinking about these issues, and we need to be committed to thinking about different ways that we can meet the goals. So again, in the CLCPA, which was generally, informing that law, behind that were a number of organizations that understand these issues very, very well. Many of the faculty from Columbia and other institutions helped to shape the thought that went into creating that, and embedding that into a law is a sure way to ensure that everyone needs to begin to be thinking about what it means to their institutions. And I do think that there's a big learning curve to really understand that. I know that when we were putting our plan together, we knew that environmental justice and baking that into a number of the ways we were approaching our goals was important. But we hadn't done that work yet. But we did commit to it in the plan to be able to sort of say, we need to go back. We need to be able to engage our thought leaders on our campus and throughout the city on this. And we need to sort of go backwards a little bit and retweak. And we're in the process of doing that now. In some of our operations, so specifically, my colleagues in transportation back at Columbia are really taking a thought leadership stance on this and really rethinking how can we minimize our impact when it comes to our intercampus shuttles? How can we rethink the way that our routes are working through the city? Obviously, you saw we have 3 main campuses throughout Manhattan, and there's a lot of we provide buses throughout those to move colleagues around, and administrators and faculty and students. So we did did a couple of years ago transition all of our intercampus shuttles to electric buses. We were one of the first in the city, and I think one of the first in many of our peer schools to do that. We worked with NYSERDA, it's a state funding agency, to provide funding to offset that, and it was a real win. And it's dramatically reduced our emissions associated with those buses. And we're now working with students to take a look at how can we reroute and make our routes more efficient. We do have greener buses, but how can we maybe take the routes out from some of the neighborhoods that we're running through to sort of consider reducing the impact there. So, I mean, that's just one super in the weeds example, but I feel like that's where you see the change. You have to dive deep into some of these areas and really get involved and say, okay, how can I set the right intention in each of our key operational areas? And that's, I think we're really proud of doing that at Columbia.
I have a lot to say about this, but because I feel like I'm a student of this right now, I have to be honest. I feel like it's something that we all have to take a deep dive in understanding. And I mean, I'll keep my remarks brief. It's so complex, and I think we have many roles to play. So I don't think there's just one response in terms of, with the city, but I think there's just this bigger level role as we think about how we educate our students, how we think about our own actions, how we prioritize our power purchase agreements. I mean, there's so much. The more I'm getting into it, the more I'm realizing there's just so much to learn, and just to figure out what we can learn from the past and pull forward. So I really do feel like I'm a student of what it means to have a just energy transition. So please keep that in mind with my comments, from global to local. I mean, I'd say on one level, the fact that this question is now being so prevalently asked it's demonstrative of the new era of awareness around the relationship between climate change and systemic racism that has emerged. I mean, I've been in the field of sustainable development since, for 25 years, and really that was meant to bake in these issues of equity and impact since the beginning. But when you peeled off into higher education, our field our roles were really more operationalized. How do you think about sustainability and climate? And I think there's a space now to finally look at these challenges systemically, which is where it really belongs. I want to also note, in terms of the meaning of just energy transition, the way that it's being dialogued around at MIT is really thinking about this shift from the move from one type of extractive economy to another. And that's really been informative for us, particularly as we shift to EV. We think about storage and really understanding the implications of the shift from one kind of extractive community to another, and where that's taking place. Again, the answers, these are just the questions that we're asking to help inform our thinking. So we're not going into it saying we have the answers, but what I'm appreciating about our dialogue at MIT is this very open discussion. In fact, I have this slide I don't have here, but I'll share what's in my head. Within 1 year at MIT, we came out with a statement on systemic racism, a statement on DI equity issues, a statement on climate action, and then all of these other commitments of the Institute to rethink education and GRIs and everything. And now a number of us are trying to come together and say, okay, so there's so much activated. Now, how do we bring these pieces together so we're also not addressing these in silos? So anyway, I just want to share that framing. The second part, so there's, again, one extractive economy to another, and then the shift from understanding the implications of current solutions to future solutions and understanding those implications. And there's a lot taking place in Boston right now from, as we think about, my understanding is, and some of you are probably researchers in the audience on this, but some of the framing is that we're going to triple our electrification, our grid in the United States in order to respond to the shift towards electrification. And where's all that going to be sited? So really thinking deeply and looking systemically at these impacts. At a local level, for me, just yesterday, in a report from the Green Ribbon was shared with me. It's entitled Our Shared History, Using Boston's Climate Opportunities to Address Systemic Racism. So that's just a whole new lens on how to shape climate action at the community level. It's not saying, well, here's one report on this and here's another report. It's really looking at integrate. It's a really moving report. So I'm not quite positioned to address this. I just literally read that yesterday, but it shows where we all need to, I think, build our expertise and be very open and empathic of how to learn about this. I'll just share a quote from that report, because I think I was saying to Jess yesterday, I think you could fill in, well, I'm going to say Boston, but in your mind's eye, maybe fill in Philly or fill in New York. But the report I read yesterday talks about the impact of climate change does not fall equally on all neighborhoods and households in Boston. Some places and people are more exposed due to location to effect that includes flooding from sea level rise to heavy rainfall or to extreme heat. Others are less able to bounce back from climate impacts because their access to financial and community resources is constrained. And a wealth of data shows that these climate vulnerabilities are disproportionately borne by Boston's communities of color, even though they have contributed far less to the greenhouse gas emissions that cause climate. So I think this just raises, if these become the underlying assumptions, then what is the role of higher education in addressing that? And I'll just share a couple of final pieces. In Boston, like I said, we have this Green Ribbon Commission that's leveraging these relationships already to address that through data collection and projects. We've embraced that MIT as a higher education institution must develop a more inclusive and participatory approach in engaging these groups. And on a very specific level, we've been building a climate resiliency model integrated with the city of Cambridge that we hope that's actually, as I said, it projects out to 2070. It looks at underground infrastructure, below grade infrastructure. We have a porosity study to understand implications to below grade areas, which are, in our case, it's research, but in the case of cities, it's apartments and subgrade housing. And so we're really working, we see it as our responsibility to leverage the campus as a test bed in these areas to then figure out how to scale that up and make that accessible through open source, whatever that appropriate way may be, and training. So to continue to stay relevant the next decade of climate and sustainability at MIT, it must address these intertwined challenges of climate action, justice, and DEI. We must ask ourselves how our plan can advance these issues of climate environmental justice in an iterative way. We can't just say we have the solution and then move forward. And so to conclude, I think we need to do more capacity building together, not to the city, but together with the cities and with partnerships. We have to build these thriving networks that address these issues, and then again, leverage our campus and communities as test beds for learning and application. So I think we're all really well positioned for that, but the time is now, to do that. So
Thank you.
do you have anything else to add as a member of the city, from your vantage point to these things?
Yeah, so build up on what Nina was talking about before. I think that the research relationships have really been fundamental. Another thing that is big right now, which we're thinking about in terms of our environmental justice strategy, is funding available through the IRA to work on specific projects in that space. And I know that we plan on approaching the university to help us figure out some of the more data related components of that, because I think that in order to be able to address environmental justice issues and resilience, we need a lot of data, a lot of research, and also just understanding on a property level basis, what are the flooding risks? Where exactly is heat going to have the biggest impact on the community? And I think that universities have been a huge partner in helping us understand some of those issues, and definitely will be as these issues evolve going forward. So we have about 25 minutes left. So I think we had a couple more questions, but I think it's a good idea if we pass over to the audience, because I'm sure you'll have a lot of very interesting thoughts on this stuff as well, and would like to hear from the panelists. So we'll have a microphone available. I see you very excited to ask something. Okay. Okay, it sounds like yeah.
Thank you.
Better
My name
for
is
the-
John. I live out along the main line, and about 600 feet from the high power lines, the 10,000 volt ones that come from the Susquehanna reservoirs to here. And if you look at the history of energy in Pennsylvania, you get it, right? There are now proposals to do pump storage along the Susquehanna and give us more hydroelectricity. I also, by the way, live a third of the mile from the Williams pipeline that goes and gives 90% of the natural gas to Manhattan. So it's like living in 3 centuries. I'm excited to see Penn and the University of Pennsylvania, especially, and the city,
So I guess maybe just understanding the question a little bit more is the idea to understand how do we see hydroelectric folding into the decarbonization strategies within our campuses?
For 20 years.
Right. Right. Well, so I think it's important to know where our fuel comes from, right? So in the case of the University of Pennsylvania, we don't actually burn that much fuel right on our campus. We purchase our electricity from PJM, which is our larger grid, which all of us feed into. And then the steam that heat and cools our building is produced at the vicinity plant in Grace Ferry. So it's all very local to, except for electricity, which that's why we're so interested in the power purchase agreement that we just developed with our solar developer AES, and that's cited in Fulton County. So, really working to utilize the strategies available to us that we can influence. And so I think in our case, hydroelectric isn't necessarily a big piece of what we expect to utilize in the next coming decades. But I'll let Catherine speak to in case there's anything else I don't know about in the city's perspective.
Yeah, to my knowledge, I don't think we're viewing hydroelectric power as a big part of our strategy. I think something that we've been embracing more recently is solar arrays and working that into the portfolio. And I think it's a question for our energy manager. We have somebody who's fully dedicated to bridging the gap between our current energy mix and where we'll need to be in the future in order to reach our goals. So I'm happy to connect you with them to talk about that further.
Yeah. I can't speak to Pennsylvania, but your question is spot on, and it just reinforces that, again, we can't solve for these issues at MIT, Penn, or Columbia in isolation of what's taking place on the grid. I know on our end, we're watching carefully hydro coming potentially from Quebec. And in fact, Massachusetts plan at one point completely was relying on that. And so it's really interesting to, we're all aware of that in a new way in this decade. People are tracking it in a way we weren't tracking it earlier. So I think your point's well taken. And I think that's where we all have to become, we're all going to continue to become students of the energy structures so that we're all tracking across grids to understand those implications. Thank you. Keep me posted.
Hi, I'm Corey Kling. I'm the Executive Director of the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy. So with that hat on, I just want to thank you all for being here today, and especially to Nina for organizing and for conceiving this in the first place. So it's really informative, learned a lot. My question is really about, and I hope you find this a fair question, because I understand that the organization was around decarbonizing our urban institutions. And you spent a lot of time talking about how we do that in terms of operations, and then a little bit maybe how we do that in the classroom, talking about educational, kind of next generation educational opportunities for students. But I'm wondering if you take maybe a step back from that and can say, what other innovations, maybe in terms of investments or in terms of new governance models that will be necessary on our campuses, or new kind of big innovative kinds of programming that we need? What would you say either you're doing or others of your peers are coming up with that you would point to? And I will say, Julie, I'm thinking about this because last week, your president emeritus Reif was on campus here and gave a fantastic lecture on the future of higher education in a deglobalizing world. And he spoke about MIT's grand climate challenges that he kind of conceived, and the raising of money for that and the allocating of those funds, and how that's going to play into the future at MIT. So I'm just curious in terms of, and I'm thinking investments, governance, and programming, but there's probably other places too. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so many things that like racing through my head. I think all those areas that you mentioned are absolutely on the table. And, we look to peers across the globe to see how they're structuring sustainability within higher education to better advance the transition and the transformation required. And I think while a couple schools come to mind, EPFL is one of them that has some really interesting organizational changes that they made to in the hierarchy of the institution, better address and recognize these issues. I think you don't necessarily need that. It's really more about having good lines of communication and building on strong partnerships. And I think where I see Penn really moving forward is just being more engaged in the community. It already has a strong history of that, but just being more in communication with the city office, more in communication with other higher education partners within the city itself, and really thinking about what that means to be a good neighbor through many lenses. And so whether that's through how do we help decarbonize our local economy, whether it's how do we address waste in our community, to better resiliency practices throughout. I think higher education has an important role to play as a listener in what that is. And I think that requires, really great relationships with the city in order to do that. And so for me, that's kind of where I think we're headed. And then programmatically, I think that will follow. I think once we have sort of a good dialogue there, then I think that's where we build the programming from. So yeah, that's where I'll end.
Just to kind of like piggyback a little bit on, you mentioned waste, and I think that is also a kind of a tip of the iceberg to the much larger question about scope 3 emissions, which is its own panel.
Yes.
We'll do that one next year. But I think that when you think about universities and decarbonizing, a huge amount of the work that's required to do that does fall in operations, because a huge amount of scope 1 and scope 2 really can only be solved, behind the walls of an institution. And oftentimes what comes from that is that when members of the university may be talking about what the institution's doing, it's like, well, what's the university doing around this? But it's directed at operations. But all of us do have a role to play, no matter where we sit in the institution. And I think just, this is a little all over the place because I feel like I had so many thoughts when you asked this question. But I do think it's an opportunity to pause and do some deep dive digging around what is each of our individual impacts. And I think, Columbia, we've started to do a comprehensive screening level analysis of our scope 3 to understand where it's all coming from. I mean, it's such a hard thing to understand because it's coming from 15 different areas, as governed by the greenhouse gas protocol. But if we can start to just directionally get our hands around that, and then to begin to educate and work with our colleagues on campus to understand what their role is in it. I think then we start to all understand that it's not just, it's not a finger pointing thing. It's all of our responsibility to start to move the levers in the way we can in an institution to decarbonize. And I think once we've done that and others are doing that in the city, it's our responsibility to talk about it and to share it and to exchange best practices and to work with the city. And also our colleagues in the city and beyond. I mean, all of us are tackling this, right now. So I think I went a little bit off to one side on that question, but,
You did great. So it's a great question. I actually appreciate you raising it. And I didn't know President Reif was down here, so that would be great. I'll have to look that up. So just going back to something I said at the beginning, we were in our 2.0 version of our climate action plan. The big leap that we took with input, it was a year-long process of input from the whole community, was to shift to this larger commitment and really making this clear statement. It was in there, but really leaping ahead. And President Reif was at the helm of this, of making sure the whole campus understood we were solving for climate change at the world level and at the campus level, and that we weren't going to do solving at the campus should never compromise our commitment to the world. And then what we're using, where I come in, is bridging that to say whatever we're using to to share and solve at the global level has to be brought down to, or the components that can be brought down onto the campus. It becomes a circular feedback process. And I think that's where the innovation comes. I mean, I used to have venture capitalists come and see me in various times where they say, you know, tell me what you see coming. Because I see our role as sustainability directors as you walk around the campus and you see everything that needs to, that has an educational value of an opportunity to be taught, shared, learned about, you know, improved, fixed, whatever it may be, and that leads to new innovations. I mean, literally, that's the lens I see things with great excitement, right, on a regular basis. So our new plan captures, as I mentioned, I don't think I included the slide, but I'm happy to send it to you, which really outlines these pillars of the campus piece you've heard somewhat about. I didn't get through everything we're doing, but you got the big picture piece. Then there's a whole arm on innovation. And there's a whole arm on educational, educational innovation and where to go from how to educate the next generation around issues of climate. And the fourth arm is around policy. And all of those are baked in with owners. That's the big difference this time around, is that they all have owners to them in order to actually not just have words on paper, but actual true, ownership to getting that work done. And so, and the governance piece, at least for now, is something called the climate nucleus that we have. So those responsible for each of those pillars and directors like myself all sit on this climate nucleus that reports up to the VP of research. So there's ongoing interaction around what all of those and committees. I don't need to get into all of it, but happy to share it with you. So we have a carbon footprint working group, we have an education innovation working group, and a policy working group. All responsible for just continuously advancing everything we've committed to and beyond. And then we meet monthly, actually really consistently to, so it's the direct, probably your equivalent. We have the MIT Energy Initiative, it's probably the climate equivalent, so it's got the directors, well, myself as this director of sustainability, but environmental solutions. I'm thinking of all your equivalents, energy, our policy person. I mean, it's an incredible resourcing group of, I always joke that it's a security issue that we're all together because it's everything we're all working on. There's like 14 of us. Okay, so that's the governance piece, but it's ongoing. So again, longer discussion, but I think this challenge is everyone's so busy. So you need these structures in place and with charges to do that. But I think we have to continue to revisit it to see if it's working. I think unification is more difficult than we sometimes wish it were. The other piece that I think you're getting at, which is what I call the 3.0 version that we're starting to work on, is who's going to be responsible for all of the new work that's got to take place as we continue to have this robust commitment to climate interventions on the campus. I always say carbon as a currency, because we need somebody who's going to manage as our local law 97, yeah, comes down. Our building energy use disclosure ordinance, $234 a metric ton. Should that be become a regulatory compliance challenge? How are we going to manage that? So there's a lot of pieces there. We do have what you said, the grand climate challenges. That's one, but that's one component. But there's this landscape of groups now that interact with industry partners, other research groups. So the challenge is keeping track of all of the amazing pieces. But I think MIT has really set us all up to just, get out there, innovate, test, try, bring it back to the campus as you can. And my goal and vision that I keep telling people, somebody will call me back and say, oh, let's do that, is I really want to set the campus up as a decarbonization lab. So we really have a structure I'm just waiting for that person to come through and say, I'm going to fund that for you. Let's do that so we can test it and then do that at all campuses. But really elevating that role of the campus as a lab and thinking of it as a decarbonization lab, and work with our internal folks to figure out where you can de-risk, right? Because you can never do something where you're going to risk your research or your students living on campus or anything. So how do you do this in a way where you're figuring out how to accelerate de-risking the technologies and learning from it without actually risking the mission? And the last piece I'll say is we're getting there. We've been in the field. I've been in the field a long time. We have to tie these commitments to the educational mission of the Institute. These can't be seen as just, that's what they're doing and this is what we're doing. I mean, there's educational value in literally everything we're doing, from the policies and the peoples to the pipes. but we have to see that educational value. And we're getting there. But that should become more prevalent, that the work that we're doing is not just seen as, when I got into the field, it was called shadow curriculum. So it felt like, oh, you would look into the shadows to see what you're learning. And it's like, let's get it out of the shadows and into the central piece. And I think there are many examples at all of our campuses, but that's where we had to start. It was like an apology to the educational mission, but I think we've moved way beyond that. And so I think that's what our unique platforms can help do across universities, and with partnerships like yourself, between Office of Sustainability and Kleinman, in my case, Energy Initiative, Environmental Solutions. So it's a great question. I appreciate you asking that. Yeah.
Okay. Can you just help me confirm if we're getting if the Q&A is on? I haven't gotten any questions, but I want to make sure that I pay attention to it. But I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Okay, I haven't. Yeah. Sorry, I also know I'd love to hear a question from a student, possibly. I think we've been hearing from a lot of.
Well, I'm not quite a student, but I am a UPenn alum and kind of local Philadelphia investment banker. And this question is for Julie, but Jessica, please feel free to chime in. I was particularly intrigued, Julie, by your kind of intersectional approach, your sense of the interconnection between systemic racism and climate action, and how necessary it was to form a cohesive front. And my question goes to the issues of asking, what kinds of partnerships have you seen with the business community? I do work with a range of developers in the Philadelphia region who are engaged in hopefully doing revitalization efforts that are responsible, as opposed to the reverse. And this is particularly a complex matter in a city like Philadelphia that is still profoundly segregated. Right, I grew up on the kind of waspy main line in Philadelphia, right? So it's segregated at the church level still. It's segregated in a whole bunch of other ways. And of course, there are issues of access to capital for women entrepreneurs and African-American entrepreneurs more broadly. That's kind of a national issue. So really at every other level, there are issues of capital, engagement, innovation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And of course, even at the endowment level, right? The state of Massachusetts under Charlie Baker, and sort of go on it, they put together a pretty fascinating bill in which I think it's sort of maybe a significant portion of the 80 billion pension fund was allocated to women money managers and money managers of color, right? And, could these kinds of things happen, this kind of introspection occur, right? Perhaps that's going to be an even more effective way of marrying idealism with practical engagement. Thank you all. I'm open to your thoughts there.
Like I said, I'm a student of this right now, so I think you answered some of your own questions with your ideas. I'm going to just humbly say I'm learning, and I would share this report from Boston. I'm actually meeting on Monday with the person who wrote the report, so I can take a deep dive in it. And I think what was so insightful for me is that, one, these are conversations we can now have openly. Like the question you just asked, I've been on panels for years. Nobody would talk about that. So the fact that we can actually put it out there and comfortably say, great question, even the ideas that you just mentioned, my understanding, and I wasn't at this meeting, so I'm saying this as, second, is being briefed on it. But I understand folks in Boston are even looking at workforce development in Philadelphia as one of the models. So I think it's so my humble response is, I'm so glad we're asking this. I think there are models that are coming. I think finally, in reading the report yesterday, remember it was just yesterday I read that, but having been a student of this for many years, it's really unpacking how did these communities end up like they are? How did the train line run? Why is, the asthma rate higher in these neighborhoods than these neighborhoods? Why is the road running through this area and not this area? I mean, I think it's unpacking how and why these components happened, and then helping us inform, as we talk about electrification, where are we assuming that the next substation is going to go? Can we course correct, as opposed to assuming it's going to go back in that, I don't want to say a community because I don't, but back in that same community where the current substation is and where there's high asthma rates. So again, I'm not saying I know how to course correct this, but the fact that we can put it on the table, have these discussions, openly look back as to how these, health risks impact one community over another, and then figure out how we don't do that again. I think that's my humble response, and I highly recommend looking at this report. Maybe at the end I can grab your email, and then why don't I share it with you? And as I learn more, maybe there's an continued opportunity for exchange. Yeah, thank you for asking that.
I would just also contribute to and say I'm also still learning a lot about this as well. But I would speak to, when you mentioned thinking about businesses and sort of giving opportunity to women and minority-owned businesses. So one thing that Columbia has done for some time now, especially when we're building our new campus, the Manhattanville campus, which is 10 blocks north of Columbia's campus. So it's about 125th Street in New York City. It's in the middle of Harlem. And as part of our commitment in working with the city and that development, we've set internal goals within the facilities operations group to ensure that as part of any procurement process in bidding work, there is a certain percentage of work that we will make sure is given to minority and women-owned businesses. I'm not saying that's like the ultimate, silver bullet, but it's something. And I think obviously we have more to learn on this to continue to grow and build on it. But I think it's important because it makes sure that people are given an opportunity to come into the door and to get opportunity. And especially in a community where there's such rich history. So I think, it's delicate. No one can lie about that. But I think, we need to keep talking about it to do our best. Yeah. And I'd love to keep talking about that as well. It sounds like there's some good ideas on it. Thank you.
And just to add a little, sorry, we're pretty much on time, so I want to wrap it up now. I think that we have some questions in the chat online that we're going to save and follow up on. And also, I think I speak for myself and probably everyone else on the committee that if you have specific questions that we didn't get to touch on today, that we're happy to follow up on those if you can route them our way and we can prepare some additional responses. So I just want to take the chance to thank everyone for their time. Thank you all for coming and priming the conversation with more questions, and we look forward to being in touch and some more answers.
Great.
Thank you.
Wow.
Linda had a question, so I just want to see if we can get her up here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think there might have been a student. If you have any questions right now, we're fine to just hang out for a little while and answer those as well.